Calming down cortisol and taming the stress hormone attack on our sleep wake cycle using naturopathic and functional medicine. That's a mouthful, but we are going to discuss today one of the very popular, although maybe not so endeared hormones, cortisol. Cortisol is known as the stress hormone. Now, for the past several weeks, I've been highlighting different hormones. And that's because when our hormones are in balance, our brain and our body are happy. When our hormones are imbalanced, our brain and our body suffer. See, our hormones regulate almost all bodily processes, and they're potent, but they can be easily triggered by various different things, including a lifestyle, including the environment, and one of the most important and most universal, stress. And interestingly, when one hormone is off, all of the others, like a domino effect, go down as well. So I just wrote and provided a video on progesterone, all about progesterone. I did an introduction in part one, and I did what happens when progesterone gets imbalanced and some natural tips using naturopathic and functional medicine to optimize progesterone and bring it back into balance. I will be providing all of the references and the resources and previous video links in the video description. So if you missed that and you want to catch up, feel free to do that and click the link in the video description. For now, we're going to talk about cortisol because what ends up happening is cortisol is kind of the main player as far as hijacking our other hormones. See, because cortisol is the stress hormone, when our body is out of balance and in survival mode, either a physiological or a psychological stressor triggers cortisol. What ends up happening is that becomes our first priority to deal with the stress, to survive, to run away, to fight, to flee, whatever we need to do. But our other functions that are related to rejuvenation, resting, digesting, basically nurturing, recovering, and helping our vitality, those are shut down temporarily because we want to be running from the lion and dealing with the issue at hand. We don't necessarily, or our bodies aren't actually thinking about reproducing or digesting a big meal at that current time. So, what I want to do is go over exactly what cortisol is, its physiological effects, how it works in the body, how we can shut it down, or more importantly, how the body does that, the relationship between cortisol and melatonin. So, where cortisol is kind of our hormone that keeps us awake and more alert, melatonin is kind of the yin to the yang of this hormone. It's more of our calming hormone and it helps us sleep. I want to discuss a little bit about normal cortisol levels, how to test for cortisol, and then, of course, how to balance in naturopathic and functional medicine style. So, we're going to be talking about lifestyle, supplements, essential oils, and herbs. Now, I am going to be, again, summarizing the article I wrote on my website. So you can get all those resources and references again in the video description. It's also based on an article that has more detail on the Rupa Health website. So that link will be there too. And then this information has a little bit more of my summary as well as some of my clinical experience peppered into. So you might want to check out both. So let me just kind of give a brief overview, just a little tiny introduction about what's going on right now in the world, because why it's so important to focus on stress. Because about 80% of America right now is considering themselves stressed, according to a survey by the American Psychological Association. And most of it is related to the current world events. So I imagine that not only Americans are, but the rest of the world is pretty stressed about the world events as well as the economy that's bouncing all around us these days. So with all this trepidation and uncertainty, adults are not getting enough sleep, they're not getting enough rest. And in fact, it's estimated that about 1/3 are getting less than the recommended 7 hours of sleep. As I mentioned, cortisol is responsible for this high alert state and what's keeping us up late. So if we can help learn how to balance it and how it's regulated in the body and what exactly it does, we become empowered to help balance our physiology for the better and benefit our brains and our bodies. And I'm going to just touch a little bit. I already did actually on this inverse relationship with melatonin and cortisol. So we'll talk about that a little bit later. But let's talk first about what cortisol is. So cortisol, like other hormones, is a steroid hormone, specifically in the glucocorticoid class. And it is made, like all hormones, from cholesterol. And it's appropriately named the stress hormone because it's produced in the adrenal glands in response to any form of stressor. It can affect almost every organ system, and there are actual receptors for cortisol on most body tissues. So as a result, cortisol is going to impact your nervous system, your immune system, your cardiovascular system, your respiratory system, your endocrine, obviously, or your reproductive system, your musculoskeletal system, and your integumentary system, your skin. So basically, you can see why stress can contribute to so many different health issues and why stress can cause seemingly disconnected symptoms because it's affecting everything at the same time. But again, its priority is to keep you safe. So this is why it's impacting all of these different vital functions. So what happens is cortisol gets cranked up, and then our rest and digest and reproduce functions get dialed down, and we're ready to fight, we're ready to freeze, or we're ready to flee. So cortisol is going to, if you think about it, if you're running away from a threat or anything that happens when you're stressed, what happens? You breathe faster, right? Your gut and your reproductive functions kind of slow down. If you're stressed, most people get a little constipated. Some people get diarrhea, but it doesn't impact our gut. And also muscle tone, blood glucose, right? So your body's going to be trying to use that sugar that it has on reserve. It's going to start to break down fat, which is called catabolism. It's going to increase your heart rate to pump oxygen into the tissues and get blood where it needs to go to run. It's going to increase your blood pressure as a result. It's going to calm down inflammation, right? So if there's any issues in the body related to immunity, cortisol is going to temporarily put that on hold. Again, it's not going to be fighting infections from the inside. It's going to be more worried about your survival on the outside. And then it's going to keep you alert and awake, right? Because the last thing you want to do is be falling asleep while you're running away from a saber-toothed tiger. So that's kind of the acute things that cortisol will do. And again, long-term cortisol kind of related to the impact and the feedback from the body can eventually your body can get kind of resistant to cortisol, and some of these effects can be actually reversed and go the other way. But we'll keep it a little bit simple for the sake of simplicity, and just focus in on that cortisol actually is impacting most of your organ systems, and it's causing your body to be on high alert and stress as a result. Now, cortisol is interestingly in the same feedback system that progesterone is, the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal. Okay. So again, there's going to be kind of like this telephone communication between different signaling molecules to eventually release hormones in this feedback loop. So what that means is cortisol is going to be a signal for cortisol. So the body's going to try to pump out more cortisol. The body will get a balance of cortisol. And then what's going to happen is it's going to kind of reverse that. So cortisol levels cease. So this feedback loop starts with stress, activating the hypothalamus gland, and that releases this signal, corticotrophin releasing hormone, appropriately named. Then the CRH is going to stimulate the pituitary to release adrenocorticotropic hormone, ACTH. And the ACTH is then going to increase in activity to stimulate cortisol synthesis and to initiate cortisol's release from the adrenal glands. Interestingly, cortisol isn't the only stimulus that occurs to activate the stress response. Norepinephrine, serotonin, and acetylcholine are also additional players that stimulate CRH in the hypothalamus, to put it more precisely. So again, cortisol's on this feedback loop. It's affecting everything in the body, and it's based a lot on our perception of a threat too. So a little bit of stress, like if you have a deadline and your body can handle all of these, making you more alert, getting oxygen to your brain and all that, can be helpful. But when you have a lot of stress, that can cause some of the more dysregulation. And so we want to make sure that we're actually helping our body perceive appropriate amounts of stress. Now, for some people, just getting an email where they can catastrophize in their minds can cause, stress throughout the whole day. So keep that in mind too. There's a mind-body connection here with this. So how does the body actually tame the cortisol release? Again, the cortisol, because it's so powerful, like most hormones, are going to be bound to proteins. Now, cortisol is going to be either bound to albumin or corticosteroid binding globulin. And so this keeps them cortisol inactivated till the body needs it and when it reaches target tissues. And again, when the body senses that there's enough cortisol, the ACTH and the CRH stimulation is going to go down. So that is kind of the whole feedback loop and the regulation and the impacts of cortisol. Now let's talk a little bit about another way that the body kind of tames this cortisol response, and that's through another mechanism known as melatonin. So most of our bodies run on a 24-hour cycle of a sleep-wake cycle. And what happens is cortisol is one of the key hormones that is highest in the early morning to stimulate our arousal. And then what happens is it's supposed to decrease throughout the evening and during the early sleep phase. And then melatonin, on the other hand, is the opposite, and it's released after sunset, and it peaks usually between 2 and 4 a.m. And then it decreases during the day. So they're opposing. And so if one is high, it can impact the melatonin secretion. If cortisol is high, it can impact melatonin secretion, effectively maybe even suppressing it, right? And then melatonin can effectively, and there have been some studies, we'll get into that in a future video, about how melatonin can impact cortisol. So again, this body-brain balance and this hormone yin and the yang, you can see how one impacts the other and how they kind of are interdependent on each other and why there's such a delicate balance between them. So if we understand that cortisol is supposed to be higher in the morning and lower at night, when you get tested for cortisol, whether it be in the blood or saliva is actually one of the best methods to measure free cortisol. But if you get it tested, remember it's going to be higher in the morning and lower at night. So those are what the ranges are related to. And I have ranges for both cortisol levels in the blood as reported by the Cleveland Clinic, as well as study values about salivary lab cortisol markers. So technically in the morning, it's going to be about 10 to 20 micrograms per deciliter. And then around 4 p.m., it's going to go down to 3 to 10 micrograms per deciliter in the blood. Salivary can be 2 to 22 about nanomoles per liter. So you have a little bit of different measurements here, and less than 12 nanomilliliters per liter, more into the late night, evening. And there's also different functional medicine tests that kind of test different times of cortisol so they can see how your body is reacting to different times of day and if the cortisol response is appropriate for what time of day it is. Those you can find actually if you click in the resources of the video description on my article, it'll go to specific tests. There's a melatonin profile, so you can check out melatonin and if that's impacting cortisol, a rhythm in what they call a CAR test, which is a cortisol awakening response test that lets you know there's a lot of correlations actually in the literature between CAR and mental health, as well as energy fatigue and some chronic diseases. And then just a CAR profile all by itself. And I'm not talking about looking at cars, although that's fun too. So we have some ideas now about cortisol. Let's look at how to balance it now that we know what it does and we know that most people are stressed out and probably producing a lot. One of the things I did not mention, but I did mention in my previous video with progesterone, is when cortisol is pumped up high, it downregulates progesterone, and it's known as a progesterone steal because the body's making cortisol again at the expense of this key player in hormonal health, but it's also downregulating other hormones as well. So we want to balance out cortisol. Sometimes one of the best ways to balance progesterone and estrogen is getting down the stress response and balancing cortisol. How do we do that? There's a lot of different lifestyle factors that we can do that actually decrease stress. So things like optimizing sleep, right? Because we're going to get more melatonin, having fun, nurturing positive relationships, limiting stress with mind-body practices. These can modulate cortisol. There's making sure that your brain gets enough nutrients, especially if there's more stress in the body. This can help the body cope with excess stress and cortisol and also help regulate some of the other hormones and responses in the body. So things such as B vitamins, foods that are rich in magnesium, omega-3 fatty acids, which are like your fish and your fish oils, making sure you get enough protein, and making sure that your gut and your brain are happy with probiotic rich and fermented foods. Because remember, some of this is about perception, right? So there's a interaction and an interlink between the microbes that are in our belly and what they digest and what they release as a stimulus through the vagus nerve up to our brain. And that can affect our mood and affect a bunch of different things in our body. So making sure that we get enough of foods that feed and make those little bugs happy will help with the stress response. Aromatherapy is great for modulating stress. It's actually one of my favorites because not only does it reduce cortisol, which there's been small studies that show clary sage, bergamot, and lavender can reduce cortisol in small clinical trials. It actually can do it. It actually can support the stress response in 8 other ways. So it can modulate your brain signals, which are your neurotransmitters. It can shift our brain waves. There's specific oils that can help get your body into a more relaxed brainwave state, modulating the alpha and the beta waves specifically. It can calm our emotions. It can enhance our cognition. So some of the oils have been shown to make you more alert and help with memory. They can support our cellular physiology because the constituents in them impact our cellular health. They work directly on the emotional brain. Our sense of smell goes directly into the emotional brain, specifically the amygdala, right? There's no relay. We do not pass go. We do not collect 200 if you're Monopoly fans. We actually go straight to smell something, emotional response. Hence the perfume industry, right? And then it also evokes memory and transforms our mood. And there's different odor receptors throughout our whole body. So even if we're not smelling something and it gets into our body, say we have a stuffy nose or something, the constituents in essential oils interact with the odor receptors and support our physiology and physical state. So you get a lot of power in essential oils if you want to modulate stress, which seems simple and seems kind of maybe woo-woo to just smell an essential oil, make sure it's therapeutic and good high quality, but you're doing a lot. And that's why it's one of my favorite interventions, because just with that intervention, that's so simple. I know I'm impacting people's physiology and stress regulation. And stress is one of the underlying issues of many, many, many chronic issues. Okay. Now, there's different sets of herbs that are great for stress and cortisol. There's the nervines, which are calming herbs, and then there's the adaptogens, which help our body adapt to stress. So some example of nervines are valerian, German chamomile, put an extra constant in there, okay, and also hops as well as St. John's wort. Again, you want to talk to your doctor about any of these interventions, especially if you're on medication, because there are some interactions. But those are some calming nervines. And then adaptogens, probably one of the most familiar to you all is going to be ashwagandha. There's also rhodiola and holy basil that I love. I also love bacopa, which is great for the brain. And then supplements can be taken specifically to calm down cortisol. There's some research on 2 amino acids, particularly L-theanine, as well as phosphatidylserine. So there you have it. We've talked all about cortisol. We talked about how to balance it with lifestyle and enhancing our nutrition and using aromatherapy herbs and supplements. And we know now that if we impact our stress response, we're going to impact our cortisol release. And that's going to help balance out not only our other hormones, but all of our bodily processes in a favorable way. So I hope that helps you gain some understanding and get empowered on how you can handle your stress and cortisol response. And I would love to hear your feedback, your comments. Please make sure you comment wherever you're listening to this, and I will be sure to answer. And I appreciate your time and your interest in this topic and empowering yourself for better health. Make sure you also review some of the free resources I have on my website, as well as the classes that I offer. And once again, have a wonderful day, and I will be back with more hormonal information coming up. So stay tuned.